Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event with Brookline Booksmith featuring Jamie Ducharme and for her book, Big Vape, in conversation with Lisa Weidenfeld. My name is Bree. I am the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We're very happy to have you be part of our community this evening. We appreciate your support of Jamie and an independent bookstore for your purchase and attendance. The chat and question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. Just set your chat to all panelists and attendees that you can talk to other people in the audience. And if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window so they don't get lost in the chat. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Lisa Weidenfeld is the senior digital editor at Boston Magazine, where she has written about such varied topics as the joys of walking in the city, pandemic anxieties, and the indignities of the pavilion concert venue's constant name changes. As a Bostonian, I feel that very deeply. Her work has also appeared in the Boston Globe, the AV Club, and Metro Boston. A native New Englander, Jamie Ducharme is now a New York-based staff writer at Time Magazine, where she covers health and science. Her work has won awards at the New York Press Club, the Deadline Club, and the Newswomen's Club of New York. Tonight, we are celebrating the release of Big Vape. Time Magazine reporter Jamie Ducharme follows James Monsees and Adam Bowen through the creation of Juul and consequently how they go from public health visionaries and Silicon Valley wonderkin to two of the most controversial businessmen in the country. With rigorous reporting and clear-eyed prose that reads like a nonfiction thriller, Big Vape uses the dramatic rise of Juul to tell a larger story of big business, big tobacco, and the high cost of a product that was too good to be true. It is a pleasure to have you both with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Weidenfeld and Jamie Ducharme. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Brookline Booksmith, for hosting us tonight. It's great to be here talking to Jamie, who I have known for many years now. We work together at Boston Magazine, and it's just so exciting to see her first book coming out. So excited to talk about this tonight, Jamie. Even back in your Boston Magazine days, you were already reporting on vaping as a phenomenon and some of the health issues that had sort of come out about it. When did you first start sort of narrowing in on the Juul story specifically?
Yeah, well, first, thank you, Lisa, for being here with me and moderating this. And thank you, Brookline Booksmith, for hosting us in our own homes. In answer to your question, Lisa, I first started covering Juul as kind of a distinct story within the vaping industry in 2018. And this was around the time that it was really starting to blow up in schools. Teenagers were just using these things all over the place in classrooms and in bathrooms. Like, it was just becoming a huge problem. And parents were confused, teachers were confused. People just didn't really understand what this product was or why it had become so popular. So at Time, we just did kind of a basic story. I think the headline was even like, what is juuling? Very basic. And I thought that would be a one-off story. And instead, I got all of these emails from parents like thanking me for explaining why their kids smelled like mango, and teachers commiserating about this happening. And it just got such a strong response that we felt as though we needed to stay on the story. And that proved fortuitous because it evolved into quite a big story over the years, and then ended up being this book.
Okay. Yeah, so I would, as a casual follower of the Juul story, I wasn't aware of how much it's a startup story. It's a public health issue, and it's, a smoking cessation device, but the narrative of Juul is very much sort of a traditional startup story in a lot of ways. When did you start thinking about it in that way, as this sort of like, public health thing, but told through this lens of a startup?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a health and science reporter, so that I came to it as a health story. I was covering, what are the health risks and benefits of these products? Why is it so problematic that young people are using them? All of those sorts of questions. And then as it just remained in the news and as we kept covering it, there were these really interesting business angles where, Congress was investigating and the company was worth $38 billion at its height, and a big tobacco company had invested, and just all of these crazy things were happening that didn't quite fit into the health and science lens, I guess. And that's when I started to realize, okay, this might be more than a series of articles. This might be a book, and where we can uncover the business side of it, the health side, and mix all of that together. Because as you say, it is kind of a classic Silicon Valley rise and fall story, where this company is founded for allegedly good reasons, and then things start to go wrong, and it gets really profitable, and then it starts to fall apart. So it fits really nicely into that Silicon Valley, move fast and break things culture. So it's got a lot of different elements, which is what drew me to the story in the first place.
Yeah, did you sort of read or watch any of the other big startup stories as you were working on this one?
I did. I read Bad Blood, which was sort of a mistake because Bad Blood is like the best reported book I can imagine. So I read that around the time that I was kind of shopping my proposal around, and that terrified me because I was like, there's no, it's very difficult to live up to the Bad Blood legacy. But that did do a really nice job of sort of helping me think about how I wanted to tell this story, because that book does such a wonderful job of taking you back to the very beginning, doing as good of a job as it can at getting you inside the heads of the people who were behind this company. And kind of breaking down the psychology as much as possible, which is difficult, of course. But as soon as I read that, I kind of knew, okay, this is somewhat what I want to do. I want to explain from the very first day, how did this go wrong, and what could it have been, and what were they trying to do?
Yeah, there's sort of a back and forth throughout the book where you're trying, or at least I was as a reader, trying to figure out, what were their motivations here? I mean, did you come away from it thinking, okay, no, the founders really did set out to help smokers, or did you come away from the reporting and the research thinking this was a for-profit, plan from the jump?
I think it's both. The two founders were smokers. They came up with this product when they were graduate students at Stanford studying product design. Both of them smoked. Both of them kind of knew that was terrible and knew that they wanted to quit, but they couldn't quite do it, or they couldn't quite find the products that made them want to do it. And so they just got to talking and thought, why don't we come up with something better? Why don't we come up with a product that mimics the experience of smoking a cigarette and the things that we like about it, but that ideally won't kill us? So I do think that was genuine. I mean, this was a product that they wanted to use, and that they kind of understood why other people would want to use, and made with that in mind. But at the same time, I mean, they were in a product design program. They weren't in a public health program. So they didn't necessarily set out to be public health visionaries. I think for them, this was a product that could be really profitable because there's a lot of smokers in the world. It could do some public good, and it could also make them really rich and successful. So I think health was part of it, but it might not have been the motivation from the beginning.
Right. Was there a safe way to create and sell this product? I mean, there's a point early on in the book where there's this sort of like marketing blitz that happens that makes it seem very cool. And it gets a lot of attention, and it's a little hard to look at it and see, obviously the marketing blitz made it look maybe a little too cool, but without that, would smokers have picked this up? Was there a way to make this both like good for public health reasons, but also popular enough that people would actually use it?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I mean, okay, so the thing to know about e-cigarettes, they were basically created whereas you light a cigarette on fire and you inhale all of that into your lungs, and it's terrible for you. An e-cigarette just sort of heats up nicotine instead of actually burning it. And the theory is that this is better for you. And that does seem to be true. It's not good for you, but it's probably better for you than smoking a cigarette. But the early models of these products were not sophisticated. They look kind of like dorky and clunky, and they got made fun of a lot, and nobody really wanted to use them. So then Juul comes out, and it looks like a flash drive. It's sleek, it kind of fits into the Apple style of products, and it's cool. It looks nice, and that was one of its selling points, is that you don't have to be embarrassed to pull this out of your pocket at work or to use it on the street. It could actually fill the place that cigarettes once held in your life. So with all that said, I think Juul took it too far. Their launch campaign, if you've ever seen it, is just neon colors and young models, and like it looks like any trendy product that would be sold on Instagram. It does not look like it's a heavily regulated addictive nicotine product. So I absolutely think that the way Juul went about it was a mistake, but I don't know, it's hard to say if it would have taken off. I think the design was good enough on its own and the product worked well enough on its own that if they had relied on word of mouth among smokers and kind of maybe tried to work with public health groups who saw potential in the product, I think eventually that probably would have worked for them. Whereas the marketing tactic that they did use blew up in their face and made everyone think that they were out to hook kids and kind of sell a good time.
Yeah, so you sort of went over this a little bit, but I was going to say, what do you think the turning point was where it went from potentially like, oh, maybe this is a public health miracle that's going to save lives, to all of a sudden just a sort of a nightmare situation where everyone's suing them, and like where was that tipping point?
I think it was that original launch campaign, not because Juul, took off as soon as that came out, because it didn't for its first year or two, year and a half on the market. It really didn't sell that well. But this launch campaign was so colorful and so flashy, and they hired like Instagram influencers and just went about it in such a way that people in the tobacco control community couldn't ignore it. They saw this campaign and they said, this looks like old cigarette ads. This looks like it's trying to get young people interested. We're skeptical of this company. And they never outgrew that reputation. And nobody was really paying that close attention at first because nobody had heard of Juul. But then when it starts to take off and, teenagers are using it in high schools across America, people started pulling up those old pictures of the ad campaign and saying, oh, look, this is kind of the vibe that we're going for. Maybe this was intentional. And I don't think they ever left that behind. And I think the story could have been different if they had started out on a stronger foot.
Yeah, how much was Juul's sort of cultural presence and place in America determined by who was using it, like the specific people who became, big fans of the company?
Yeah, I think tremendously. If most people have heard of Juul, they associate it with teenagers using it, like Juul tricks on Snapchat and kids using it in the school bathroom, and the teen vaping epidemic is sort of synonymous with Juul. Like kids would say juuling instead of vaping because it was that widespread. And I think, there were adults using it this whole time for its intended purpose of helping people stop smoking cigarettes. But the teen problem just got so much news coverage, rightly so, that was all people associated with Juul. And public health officials are not going to ignore it when there's this outbreak of teenagers vaping in school bathrooms. So I think that Juul, it's going to be really hard for Juul to ever overcome that, because that is its reputation, that is its cultural significance. And the fact that adults use it gets kind of lost in the shuffle because so many people are so worried about this kid problem and how to regulate their way out of it.
Yeah, there are so many moments in the book that, as we're looking back at it, it's very easy to see them as sort of like Cassandra moments where they're being warned, like, oh my God, don't do this thing. You're going to get sued if you do this, or like, this is just a bad idea. And then they ignore this advice and go forward and do the thing. Anyway, what was the most sort of shocking one of those for you? The most shocking moment when we were doing the research for this?
There are quite a few of those moments. It was sort of a trend actually in the reporting of, finding the evidence that somebody warns them and then they go and do bad things anyway. But the most shocking, I think, is this program they launched towards the end of 2017 and into 2018, where Juul's really popular in schools at this time. It's all anybody can talk about. So the company decides that they want to hire an educational consultant who can put together a curriculum about why vaping is bad and why teenagers shouldn't do it. And so what they decided to do was go to schools with this curriculum and offer to pay them $10,000 or more to teach Juul's curriculum in their schools. which I think it's fairly intuitive why that's not a great idea for a tobacco company to do. But it's even worse because Philip Morris, the company that owns Marlboro, had done the same thing in the early 2000s. And then all of these studies were published saying essentially that program backfired and made kids want to smoke more because they were familiar with the branding and everything, because this program had come into schools. And public health experts warned Juul about this. They told them it was going to look bad. They told them not to do it. And the company went forward with this program anyway. And that was just so shocking to me, kind of on its own. It's a shocking idea for them to do, but it was also just, I couldn't quite wrap my head around the fact that this actually got through the levels of approval it would require to happen, and to actually start pitching these grants out to schools, despite all the warnings and despite what I would argue are some fairly obvious red flags about why this is not a great idea.
Yeah, one of the sort of more startup-y angles here is that they were very focused on being sort of, different from the big tobacco companies of the past. And because of that, they chose not to hire people from big tobacco who had experience at those companies, because they really, in their telling of it, they sort of wanted to differentiate themselves. But then that meant they didn't have anyone with the expertise to say, oh, we tried that, don't do that. Just absolutely stop what you're doing right now. Although, as we're discussing, some of the time they ignored that when they got that advice. Anyway, so you talked to a bunch of people at the company. Throughout the book, there are some unnamed folks along the way. Did you find that there was a sense of regret at all when you talked to them, or what was the sort of feeling when you would talk about this stuff with them?
Yeah, I found that there were, I would say, 3 distinct camps of ex-Juul employees who I spoke to. There was one group that really still full-heartedly believes in this company, and kind of is very passionate about defending it. There's one group that is incredibly embarrassed they ever worked there, and like deletes it from their LinkedIn profile and doesn't want to talk to you about it and just wants to forget that period happened. But I would say the largest group, the third group, is people who joined the company because they genuinely thought there was promise to this product and that it could help adult smokers, and then became very disappointed when they saw the way that things went and the way that the company was mismanaged. A lot of people who went to work for Juul did it because either they used to smoke, or they had a loved one who used to smoke, or because they knew somebody who had used an e-cigarette to stop smoking. And so I think for those people, it was really personal when things started to go wrong and Juul started to just get torn apart in the media and hated really for what it had done to teenagers. And especially when, Altria, the big tobacco company that owns Philip Morris, ended up investing in Juul. They paid $12.8 billion for a stake in Juul. When that happened, I think so many people who worked at the company were just sort of heartbroken because they joined this company for good reasons, and they hadn't signed up to work for big tobacco. And all of a sudden, that's the biggest outside investor in the company. So there is a real sense of regret, and I think missed opportunity from a lot of people who worked at Juul, and also people, who work at other companies in the industry and just kind of watch this story play out.
Yeah, there's often a sort of like a sense that just like as soon as people smell money around Juul, then that also sort of sends them inevitably down this path that everyone, sort of seizes on it as like, here's a big investment opportunity. Do you think it's possible for a values-driven company to succeed in Silicon Valley without getting corrupted by that sort of sense of profit?
It's a big question, Lisa. I don't feel that I'm qualified to answer it, but I will try. I think that Juul's biggest problem was that they didn't have anyone on staff, as you say, who understood the tobacco regulatory landscape, but also in the early days, they didn't really even have people who knew how to run a company. Like, it was founded by 2 really talented product designers. They brought on some engineers and some marketers in the early days. And I think they really needed somebody who could help steer the ship and help them grow in a responsible way, and help them, get started on the research they needed to do, and think about how to market the product responsibly, and do all these things that a well-run company should do. And either they didn't have the money to do that, or they didn't think it was necessary, or I'm not sure why that didn't happen, but I don't think they had that strong kind of leadership presence. To your larger question of whether it's possible for a values-driven company to succeed, I think it is, but I think there's a reason we see this story play out so many times of, bright idea goes wrong, missed opportunity. Like I think when money and investors and boards start getting in the picture, it just gets complicated, because even if the founders really believe in this mission, there are people there whose job is to care about the bottom line and how fast the company grows. And I think it's hard for those two things to coexist in a responsible way.
Right. Yeah, those two founders it's sort of, again, a sort of a story you hear a lot in Silicon Valley, like two friends come up with an idea together, and, both of them, it's a two-person project, and then like midway down the path, all of a sudden there's this falling out that happens there. And also the way you sort of describe them is this very odd couple thing, where one of them is like, the sort of talkative one who's all personality, and then the other one is like silent, I think, when they do public events together. When you interact with them in real life, is that basically the impression you get of them?
So I've only spoken to them together one time, actually at a Time magazine party. I met both of them, and it's exactly what you just said. James is sort of the charismatic, outgoing founder. He's maybe a little too confident, but very charming, very funny, like charismatic guy. And then Adam, the other co-founder, is just stoic and very quiet and kind of looks at you stone-faced and is very hard to read. And somehow they became friends anyway, despite those vastly different personalities. But yeah, sort of every early investor or early employee that I talked to described them as an odd couple, or a little bit of a mismatch. And eventually, from what I learned, those two personalities did start to clash a little bit. And what started out as a Stanford friendship, I think, became something more like, it was described to me as like a married couple that kind of tolerates each other's quirks, but is not so much happy about them anymore. Like they were not friends by the time Juul really started to take off. And I don't think that served the company well, because there wasn't like a strong leadership team. It was sort of in disarray, and the two founders aren't talking anymore. And I don't think that's a great environment for a company to grow in.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, how much does that fraying relationship affect what happens at the company? I mean, I assume people, like when people first joined on, it was like, these two friends are going to lead us, down the path to success. What does that, like, when it's the sort of like brain trust that came up with the product, when that relationship frays, what effect did that have?
Yeah, old employees described it to me as like, if you looked closely, you could tell that they were not close friends anymore, but they were civil to each other. They weren't, screaming in the office, but I did hear a story of them running into each other on the street in San Francisco, and just neither of them said a word. Like they did not want to have a relationship outside of work. So I don't know to what extent that tension affected the company, but I think what became apparent is that neither of these founders was particularly well suited to being the CEO. They both tried it at different times, and they both ended up getting replaced. I think, one of them, neither of them really were like great at doing interviews and pitching investors and doing all of these things that a growing company needs to do. And eventually they did get replaced by more experienced CEOs, and a board came on. And that's when I think the company starts to sort of shift away from two mission-driven friends from Stanford and into more of a profit-driven machine.
Yeah, there's a couple leadership changes. It starts, I think, with Adam is in charge first, and then James, and this other CEO comes in, and then by the end of the book, there's a completely there's another one in there. I think I'm skipping a CEO. There's a series of CEOs that
there's several.
There's several that are sort of leading the way, and the company seems to sort of take on different personas each time a new person is in charge. And because of that, it starts to feel a little hard to pinpoint an architect and say, like, okay, this is the person, who like set the company down this path. How much of that was just sort of like the ultimate result? How much of that is just a snowball effect versus like saying, okay, like, the stuff that really shapes Juul happens under this specific leader?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's a clear villain in the story, or somebody who messes up so epically that the company can't recover. I think it's more of a series of nobody quite having the experience to make the smart decision at several different junctures. It's not like there's one person who's repeatedly making these missteps. It's just that the company as a whole didn't have that backbone that it needed to really think about how it was going to grow. And then once it did really start to take off, I mean, the company was growing so fast that it just couldn't keep up. And I think the growth started to outpace, where the company actually was and the research that it had and the people even that it had in place to keep the company moving forward. It was just get it into more stores, get more people using it, and that kind of blew up in their face because it was the wrong people who ended up using it.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that I was sort of surprised about is I didn't know that much about the FDA's role in something like this and how they kind of just hit the market without the FDA really weighing in on their product. And throughout the story, the FDA really seems to be playing catch up. Like Juul is just like way down the road selling these like mango flavored vaping devices. And then the FDA is like, it's time to regulate.
Yeah. I think a lot of people don't realize, like, to this day, these products are not FDA approved. All the e-cigarette manufacturers had to file their applications for approval only last September. So for the decade or so that they were on the market before that, it was sort of a loophole where the FDA obviously knew about them and was allowing them to be sold, but they're not actually approved. So it was very much a game of catch up where the FDA, this is also crazy to me, only got the ability to regulate any tobacco product, including cigarettes, in 2009, which is not that long ago. And at that time, nobody really knew what to make of e-cigarettes. So they just didn't really bother making a regulatory rule for them. And it took 5 or 6 years after that original legislation for them to finally draft a policy about how to regulate these products. And by that time, there were, numerous manufacturers out there, tons of people using it. It was almost too late. Like you can issue this rule, but if millions of people are already using the products, it's difficult to put that genie back in the bottle. So I do think it would have been a really different story if the FDA had proactively set standards for how these products could be sold and, how they needed to be made to ensure that they were safe and all of these sorts of questions. But yeah, Juul and every company on the market was kind of operating without a rule book and without much oversight. So they could do pretty much whatever they wanted, which is kind of crazy for something that you inhale into your lungs.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm just an uninformed consumer, but I think I would make the assumption that like, oh, of course, this has been regulated. This has been, processed through a federal organization of some kind to make sure it's safe for me. And it's hard not to think that other people would make that same assessment. When I'll try this product. There's no reason to think that the FDA hasn't weighed in, and it's just not true.
Right. I mean, especially when the company was worth billions of dollars. So I guess I would assume if you're that successful and that big and just that many people are using your product that you've been through some regulatory checkpoints, but that, it turns out, is not always the case, which I think is good to keep in mind when you try new and untested things.
Yeah. Having spoken to, smokers, public health experts, et cetera, how do you feel about the future of e-cigarettes as a smoking cessation product? They're finally going through this regulatory process now. The FDA is going to weigh in on them. Is there a future for them? I mean, what do you think is going to happen with this? Not even specifically Juul, but just more generally, this was held up as a big smoking cessation thing, and it's sort of hard to see where that'll go now.
Yeah, I think there are two very passionate groups in public health, one of which kind of thinks that e-cigarettes are amazing and could be really impactful for smokers and could give them a much better, a much safer alternative. And then there's another group that thinks that e-cigarettes are, if not as bad as cigarettes, they're almost as bad, or at the very least not effective enough to justify recommending them to people. And there's studies on both sides. I mean, you can find one study that says, yes, they do help smokers quit. And then the next week, a study will come out and says, no, actually they don't. And, there's studies that say they have fewer carcinogens in cigarettes. And then there's another study that says, oh, but they're bad for your lungs in other ways. And it's really hard to figure out how impactful they actually could be. And after reading many of these studies, where I've come down on it is obviously you don't want to inhale anything into your lungs that you don't have to. Like if you don't smoke, you should not vape. But I do think that for people who smoke cigarettes, this is a better alternative, at least in the short term. It's, they haven't been around long enough to know how they affect you in the long term. But I think there is a place for them. They're not, the best thing for you in the world, but there is a place for them in that there are millions and millions of smokers in the world. And if you can get even a small percentage of them to do something safer, that's good. That's a really impactful thing for public health. I think the question is whether the bad reputation of e-cigarettes has gotten so bad that it's sort of outweighing that potential. Like if smokers only associate these things with, mango flavored vapes that teenagers use, and so they don't use them to quit smoking, that really obviously cuts into the amount of good that they could do. So I think Juul had a product that could have done a lot of good, and the way that the company was managed sort of cut into that potential. And I think it's actually somewhat of a sad story. They sort of ruined what they were setting out to do with some of the decisions that they made.
Yeah, by the end of the book, the trend has sort of like died down for a couple of reasons. One of them being literally the pandemic. This was sort of a social habit for teens, and then, hopefully they weren't hanging out together the same way. They were all, like huddled in a bathroom at their high school, smoking Juuls together. Other trends come in, etc. But the other big thing that happens in the book, and that I'm sure many people on the call can remember, is that there's this huge scare that happens around this, are we calling it EValley? I'm trying to get okay.
Right, yes.
Around the EValley, which is the sort of vaping illness that seems to come out of nowhere. People are getting, you hear these horror stories about very young smokers in the hospital with, terrible health issues. And this craze happens. It's all over the news, and everyone points their finger at Juul. And then ultimately, it turns out it's not Juul. It was, I think, sort of off-market vaping products that were specifically being used for marijuana and not e-cigarettes. But of course, by then, the sort of narrative has been set. As a health reporter, did that sort of furor make you start thinking differently about how you cover public health stuff like this? Like, were you sitting there watching this and saying, oh, we don't have enough evidence yet, but this narrative is just building?
Yeah, well, it's sort of funny now. I've been covering the pandemic for the last year, so it's a little, not funny is the wrong word, but everybody was so panicked about this. And there were, I think a little bit over 1,000 cases, and it's just a little wild because the scale is so different. But you're right, at the time that this was happening, it was a huge story. People were panicking. It was really dramatic. Teenagers were having lung failure and needing lung transplants, and it was a really scary time. And nobody knew exactly what was happening. Authorities had kind of figured out that vaping seemed to be the common thread that was sickening people, but they didn't know which product it was, which substance people had vaped before they got sick. There were a lot of outstanding questions. But I do think because Juul was such a household name at that time, and it was just, if you read a story about vaping, it was almost always about Juul at that time. It was kind of natural that people's minds went there first. But it as you say, it turned out to not be Juul. It was these black and gray market THC products. And I do think that was a little bit of a wake up call, or should have been a little bit of a wake up call for health media of there's these investigations take time, and there's a lot unknown at the outset. And the most obvious assumption is not always the correct one. So I think that helps sort of frame the way these outbreaks should be covered in the future, which became useful much sooner than I expected when there was another mysterious respiratory illness not that long after. But yeah, I think it was a obviously scary story for so many people. And I think that even though it did turn out that Juul and other nicotine products were not, for the most part, behind these illnesses, I think that changed the way so many people thought about vaping, because if you thought it was kind of harmless water vapor before, that totally changed your mind when you see these really dramatic images of kids in hospital beds, for sure.
Yeah, it certainly stuck out in my mind as I was reading it that there was, I mean, we went through something really similar right after. I mean, the scale, as you point out, is very, very different, but it's some similar framework there where everyone's very panicky and desperate for information. And then these narratives pick up and it's so hard to rein them back in. Once it gets rolling, that people are feeling a certain way about a news story, it's really hard to change people's minds about it. Are there points where you find yourself sort of getting frustrated seeing like these public narratives emerge around something that, you know, they go for the most scandalous version of it rather than the probably more boring reality?
Yeah, I did. When I would speak to ex-Juul people, like one of the themes that kept coming up was they just felt sort of cheated because there were so many stories when this lung disease outbreak first happened. And then when it came out that it was THC products for the most part, you know, news outlets covered it. I remember writing about it, but there were way fewer stories about that. And it had sort of felt like, you know, it was out there and then there wasn't a ton done to correct the record, was sort of the feeling within the company. So yeah, as a journalist, I mean, that definitely gave me a lot to think about the way we cover these stories and how important it is to emphasize what you don't know, and to avoid kind of leaping to those conclusions. But yes, did turn out to be useful over the last year and a half, I think.
You're like a respiratory expert now.
I simply love to write about respiratory disease.
Yeah, this is a cool, fun tidbit about Jamie is because she was our former wellness editor. I like just periodically ask her health questions just because she's like a doctor, basically, I think. So.
I'm not a doctor. I'm
Don't
not a doctor.
Okay, fine, we'll get that on the record here. So were there any, so obviously it's like a whole huge narrative. There's a lot of different sort of threads to pull at. Were there any tangents you didn't get to explore that you wish you'd sort of found room for in the book?
Well, Lisa, as two people who love to gossip about Boston area public figures, I know we have discussed this this little drama, but I wish I had gotten into the book that Martha Coakley, the old Attorney General of Massachusetts, at one time was very skeptical of the e-cigarette industry and kind of was coming down hard on them for what she saw as marketing to teenagers. And then a couple of years ago, she went to go work at Juul, actually, in their government affairs team. So that was a huge about face, which would have been dramatic enough, except that now the current AG of Massachusetts, Maura Healey, is suing Juul. And personally, as someone very invested in New England drama, I would have loved to unpack that in the book, but it just unfortunately did not make it in there. So maybe that will be the sequel.
AG versus AG showdown.
Exactly.
And Healy, of course, is also, I think, was also considered to be her sort of protege when she had previously worked for her. So
right. So that was one thing. Another, this is in the book to some extent, but I think it's really fascinating, is just I was talking a little before about like how passionate both sides of this debate are. Like there are scientists on both sides, pro and anti vaping, and they're all just so fired up about it. And this might not sound crazy, but people in public health are usually very polite and friendly and cordial, and they kind of build upon each other's work. So to have a debate that passionate in this field is a little wild to me. But I did have to sort of acknowledge that the average person is not as nerdy as I am and would not want to read an entire chapter about that. So that got downsized a little bit as well, but I think it's an interesting wrinkle to the story.
The big public health battle over whether or not these are.
Yes.
So yeah, we talked about this a little bit, but what do you think the future holds for Juul as a product? Like, can they right now are facing a lot of headwinds. They, you know, are being sued. I think they have a series of lawsuits still working their way through the courts. The FDA hasn't even weighed in yet on whether or not their product is, you know, allowed to be on shelves. You know, if you stared into your crystal ball, what do you think the future is for Juul?
$1 million question, Lisa.
It's a $36 billion question.
$38 billion question. So I think the FDA has a really hard choice ahead of them. Not a hot take, but it's hard. It's hard because they have come out so strongly against teen vaping that I think it will almost be hard for them. It would be a little hard for them to walk that back and allow these products to stay on the market, just because, I mean, in 2019, 2018, when this problem was really at its height, it felt like every day there was a new FDA statement about the epidemic of teen vaping and what they were going to do to stop it. So I think with that behind them, it could potentially be difficult to allow these products to remain for sale. But at the same time, there is pretty compelling evidence about how they could be helpful for adult smokers. So it's a really tough equation. Truthfully, I think Juul and others will get FDA approval, but I wouldn't be shocked if they didn't, is how I feel. Like I could really see it going either way. But the lawsuits is another huge problem for Juul. They've been sued by close to a dozen state attorneys general, about 100 school districts, and then there's this massive multi-district litigation of lawsuits from around the country that have been basically rolled into one mega lawsuit that is also sort of coming to a head in the next year or so. And I think that could be a huge problem for them, just financially as well as reputationally. They don't have a ton to lose there. So any other hits to their reputation are not going to do them any favors, especially while the FDA is currently reviewing these applications. So I don't think they will, even if they get approval, I don't think they will be as influential as maybe they could have been if things had gone better for them. I think the product has scared a lot of people away and has not won a lot of fans. So I don't think the future is as bright for them as certainly their founders would have wanted it to be.
Okay. Well, that gives us a good pivot to our questions from the crowd. From an anonymous attendee, what are the founders doing now?
Neither of them are actually with the company anymore, which is kind of interesting. James left right when the pandemic started in March of 2020. He left the company. Don't know what he's doing now. He has not publicly said what he's doing, but he's no longer with them in any capacity. And Adam, the other founder, this was actually sort of a dramatic thing I learned in my reporting. From what it sounds like, he just sort of up and left one day and went to Argentina, where his wife is from, and brought his kids and brought his wife and went to live down there. And I think was planning to stay until the pandemic hit and then did come back. But he is also, I think he works for Juul as a consultant, but is also not with the company full time. So now those guys are gone, and it's sort of, from what it sounds like, being run by executives from Altria, the tobacco company that invested in them. So a very different culture from the sort of like wild Silicon Valley startup that it used to be.
It's kind of funny that Adam is the one that is still loosely sort of affiliated with the company, because he certainly seems like a little bit more disconnected from the action earlier on than James does.
Yeah, I wish I had better insight about why that is the case, but that does seem to be how it's shaken out.
Okay. And then another question: when writing a book about such a polarizing topic, there's obviously going to be people who are unhappy, regardless of what you write. Despite that, what would you say you're most proud of about this book?
Oh, what a nice question. There are lots of people who are unhappy about everything to do with vaping. So that's
journalism is also kind of that goes.
Yes. I think so. I worked really hard to give a voice to smokers in the book, I would say. Like, I think they often get kind of left out of the conversation. People get so wrapped up in kids using these products for really understandable reasons. I mean, the stories are so dramatic, and no one wants to think of a young person getting addicted to nicotine. So I understand why that gets so much attention. But I do think at times people sort of forget that these products were meant for adults who really need help, getting off of cigarettes. And for some of them it is helpful, and it can be, a really useful thing for adult smokers. So I'm proud that I got to tell both sides of that, I think, because, it is a voice that's not always heard. So I'm glad that I got to do that.
Okay. Next question. What is your next hot topic?
That's a great question. I actually just today was asked to come up with non-COVID pitches at work, and I drew a huge blank because that's all I've written about. So if anybody has ideas that are not about Juul or COVID, please drop them in the chat. I need them.
pass on your great story ideas to Jamie Ducharme.
Yes, please.
Any other questions? That was the last question, but if anyone else wants to throw one in there, I'm happy to pass them on. Give them another minute, maybe. Yes, no. Okay, maybe we've gone through all of them. All right. Bree, do you want to rejoin us?
Hey, thank you so much. That was super fascinating. Jamie, I have a question for you.
Oh, please. Yes.
When you started writing, did you kind of have an idea of like what you were, like what your perception was of Jewel? And did you find that changing as you wrote?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I will say a lot of my previous reporting on the company had been very critical, and did focus mostly on the youth angle. And that's a huge topic in the book, but I do think speaking to so many people who joined the company helped me kind of think about, here's what they were trying to do and here's why people wanted to work for this company, and hearing how sad people were about how it had turned out, I think was illuminating for me and helped kind of flesh out the story. I think Jewel deserves the vast majority of the criticism it gets, but it did help me think about the story in a richer way to talk to so many people who had joined this company for a reason and did think that there was potential there.
Oh, and it looks like people are getting back into the Q&A box, which is awesome. Keep them coming. How did the COVID epidemic affect how you reported the story?
Well, I planned to do a lot more travel for the book than I was able to. I was actually supposed to go to San Francisco, I think the week that they locked down. They were the first city in the country to lock down, I remember. So that didn't happen. And then I did end up writing the whole thing from my New York City apartment instead of traveling, which is a shame. It's always nice to meet people in person and to hear their stories that way. But yes, it was written through a lot of Zoom calls and a lot of phone calls. But it came together.
Next question. Is it true that there is a TV docu-series in the works about the rise and fall of Jewel? And have you been, has anyone reached out to you about consulting on the show?
The rumors are true. Yes, the book is being adapted into a docu-series with R.J. Cutler, the filmmaker, which is very exciting. I am indeed consulting on it as well, and I have very few other details to offer, but it is happening. I think it'll hopefully in the next couple of months, there will be more details to share. So that is very exciting and cool.
Wow, that is exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What was writing the book during a pandemic like? Did you conduct any interviews for the book over Zoom, which of course you just said that you did. Do you feel like writing during the pandemic made this a different book than it was originally going to be?
Yeah, I did a lot of Zoom interviews. It was difficult personally. I don't know if this is why the question was asked, but I mean, I'm a health reporter in my day job, so I had intended to take off a decent amount of time to write the book, and that was no longer possible because I couldn't leave writing about the pandemic. So it was a lot of early mornings and a lot of weekends and a lot of nights. But at the same time, I think I don't know, I kind of think that I needed a project during the pandemic, and it helped to have something totally un-COVID related to train my mental energy on in my free time. So it was a lot and it was stressful, but I also think, I don't think the book suffered because of it. It was just a very different schedule and a very different pace than I was expecting it to be.
Do you think that writing about COVID and writing about vaping at the same time, did they kind of help put one another into context at all, or change the lens through which you looked at vaping?
I think the one thing is I did sort of, when you see the millions of cases that have been reported, COVID cases that have been reported, it does sort of put things into perspective. With just how panicked people were about this lung disease outbreak in 2019. Not to say that wasn't scary and deserving of attention, but the scale was just so different. I think, that did sort of put things into perspective a little bit. But it was also interesting because at the beginning of COVID, there were a lot of questions about, do people who smoke and vape have worse cases of COVID? And does that kind of change your risk profile? So for a short time there, the two topics did intersect in a way that I was not expecting. But yeah, I think reporting on something like a pandemic does just sort of change the scale. Like I had never, of course, written about anything as huge as the pandemic. So it puts everything into perspective, I think.
How is writing a book different from writing an article?
It's a little, so when I first started talking to my editor, I said some off the cuff comment like, oh, a book's just 15 feature stories stitched together, right? Like 15 chapters. And he said, no, do not think of it that way. That's not how a book is. That's what we tell our journalists not to do when they think about how to write a book. And I was like, cool, roger that. Because it is very different. In an article, you sort of have a contained story arc, and you don't have to think so much about how is this character going to develop over time, and how do I show the way that their thinking has changed. It's more of like a snapshot in time for the most part. Whereas this book covered like 15 years of time. So it was difficult to map out, here's who Adam and James were at the beginning, and here's how they changed as the company grew, and here's how other people were introduced and changed the trajectory. So it was very different. I mean, I can't imagine writing a novel and having to actually think of all that stuff. I at least had people to tell me how they changed and what happened. But yeah, it was a really different kind of writing than writing an article. And it was actually kind of a fun puzzle for me to figure out how to do that because it was so different.
So you've obviously done just a ton of research. Has anyone reached out to interview you about vaping with the knowledge that you've gained over the past couple of years?
They have, and I always feel a little weird about it because I'm, as I said to Lisa, not a doctor. And I feel like it's my job to try to synthesize what the actual experts say to me, and less my job to sort of have my own takes about it. But I do, I've read many of the studies, so I can recite those findings back to people pretty well. But I always try to push people more towards the actual medical experts who have been to medical school.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we'll ever get a fictional retelling a la The Social Network about the Juul story? And if we did, who would you cast? I love Dreamcast questions, so I'm really excited about this one.
Oh man, I don't know. Lisa and I were actually talking about this question though, and I do think Jesse Eisenberg might have to come back because I think he would make a really good, I could actually see him kind of playing either of the founders, depending on how he wanted to play it. He looks kind of like James, one of the founders, so maybe that would work. But that's a good question. I'll get back to you on that.
All right. Let's see. So you did mention that in the book you wanted to kind of look at this from the perspective of smokers and kind of give them a voice too. Do you see a future where Juul does kind of become more acceptable for people to move from smoking traditional cigarettes to vaping to no longer smoking?
Maybe. I think if the products get FDA approval, that will obviously give them some legitimacy that they don't currently have. Because basically what goes into that application is the companies have to boil it very down, like simplify it quite a lot. They have to prove that their products have a net benefit for public health. So essentially that's, do they have enough benefit for adult smokers? Like, does it help them quit? Is it healthier or less dangerous than a cigarette? And are those benefits significant enough that you can kind of overlook or outweigh any health risks that come from the e-cigarettes themselves, or from getting young people addicted, or for getting people who don't currently smoke addicted? So if the FDA decides that they do have a net benefit for public health, I think that'll give the whole industry really a better leg to stand on, and will calm down the debate a little bit. So if that happens, I could see it. If that happens, and if the teen addiction rates don't rise dramatically, I could see it becoming more acceptable.
And of course, in any of these situations, doctors, healthcare professionals, scientists who are actually doing the research know best, right? So
yes,
please do read Big Vape, because it is super interesting, fascinating story of a startup, rise and fall, and just, I love it. I loved it.
Thank you.
Thank you both, Jamie, Lisa, everybody in the audience. Jamie, do you have any final words?
I would just like to thank you, and thank Lisa, and thank everybody for coming. I appreciate it.
Of course, thank you. Can't wait to see the docuseries. That's going to be really interesting. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Stay tuned. I know very little about it, but we'll have more to share someday.
Thanks, and congratulations on your book. Everyone, you can find our future events at brooklinebooksmith.com/events. And thank you all. Good night. Stay safe.
Thank you.